everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this public debate on mobility, on urban mobility. My name is Tim Stonor, and I am your host for this afternoon. I'm also the mentor for the program that's taking place this week at the Foundation, where we're studying in depth the subject of urban mobility from a number of different angles with a stellar cast of professors who have come here to bring their insights and experiences to a group of scholars. Let me also welcome the many people joining us online through digital means. They, like you, are very welcome. The first order of our business today is to bring the speakers onto stage for a photograph. So if we could ask you, Norman, Alfredo, Tilly, and Carlo, we'll do a quick photograph. Good, let's put Norman in the middle, between you and, there we go. Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Norman, if you would stay. Do you want your notes?
Yes.
Okay. I can speak from here. I'm mic'd up, aren't I? Let me introduce Norman Foster, who is going to say a few words at the beginning of this debate. Norman, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you all for being here today. This is the fifth public debate related to a workshop of the Foundation. As Tim said, it brings together the top minds in terms of students and mentors from around the world. The spirit of the Foundation is to prepare younger generations to anticipate the future. And it does that through an educational program, and also projects. And the two come together with BYD, who I'd like to thank for their sponsorship, making this event and the workshop itself possible. And I'd like to quote from their mission statement. They are pioneers in battery technology. And I think the statement is one sentence that sums it all: to change the world by creating a complete clean energy ecosystem that reduces the world's reliance on petroleum. So in that sense, there's a natural synergy. And the week-long workshop that brings 10 students from around the world and 8 mentors, each distinguished, whether they're civic leaders, practitioners, consultants, academics from 5 continents. And BYD have pioneered research also into a new generation of monorails. And the theme of urban mobility, which over this week-long workshop explores the role of pedestrians. And Tim Stonor didn't mention, but we go back several decades in terms of anticipating pedestrian movements and seeking to improve the quality of public space in cities. And Tim, who I'm very grateful for mentoring this whole project, will be talking about that. So really, whether it's pedestrian movement, whether it's public transport, rapid transit systems, right through to supersonic travel, those are the issues that we're sharing, exploring, debating over this week. And one aspect of that is BYD's research into a new generation of monorails. And I'd just like to give a glimpse into that world. And it starts with click. Should change. I'll try the other one. It starts with Bond Street, and going back, this is Bond Street today, and interestingly, monorails have always been associated with the future. They've always been a futuristic vision. And in 1935, an unknown draftsman artist conjured up a vision of Piccadilly in 2050. And it's quite interesting that there are adverts telling you how to take a trip to the moon or take a trip to Mars. And the monorail figures hugely in that vision of the future. And interestingly, this vision of the future anticipates Bucky's dome over Manhattan. The whole of London is covered with some kind of great glass series of spheres. And the first monorail was the end of the 19th century. And there's a recurring theme. They really relate very much to fairs. And are dismantled after the fair. And probably the reason that they never took off is that they were really overtaken by a new kind of mobility at the turn of the century, the car. Although interestingly, in America at the turn of the century, there were more electric cars than there were internal combustion cars. And it's kind of interesting that at this point we're contemplating the revolution in travel, which will probably change dramatically and morph into something combined with artificial intelligence, platforms, and so on. So those days, arguably, are numbered. And the proliferation of the car has led to something that we now take for granted, the congestion, the pollution. And so, interestingly, one aspect of our explorations this week is the role that the monorail might play in addressing some of those issues. Given now a technology which at the time of its birth didn't exist. So there's a transformation there, and what we are doing with BYD is looking how such systems might transform the quality of life in a series of generic city types. And one is the high-rise, high-density, whether that is the core of a city like Mexico City, or whether it's a city itself like Hong Kong, and also how it might improve the quality of life and public space in a high-density, low to medium-rise city like London, but that could be Boston, it could be Paris, any number of cities, or a city which is more characterized by urban sprawl, for example, the Bay Area or Los Angeles, and also the kind of city that when city planners talk about cities, they don't often include, but it's 14% of humanity, and it's the informal settlements. And that's an extraordinary challenge in terms of how you address clean water sanitation, mobility, power to that huge segment of society. And here it's interesting to compare in terms of public transport and the way in which you might stimulate change and improve the environment and increase mobility. If you look at the impact in terms of a monorail, then it is literally and obviously elevated above the prime public space. It doesn't interfere with that. And obviously the ultimate response to that is is the metro system, the light rail system. But each of those is extraordinarily constraining in terms of the physical realities of turning a corner or negotiating a slope. And in those terms, the monorail is extraordinarily adaptable to an existing infrastructure. It can also provide a framework for new settlements. And here, in terms of cost and time, it is 3 times the construction time, 1/3 of the construction time of going underground, and a fraction of the cost. And in terms of energy, there are extraordinarily high benefits, and the speeds are very comparable with other systems of public transport. And if we look at the energy consumption per passenger, and we start to compare that with rail systems, diesel rail, London Underground, somewhere here, motorcycles are moving across to more conventional automobiles. And then in terms of CO2 emissions, a system like that is also an extraordinarily high performer. But what we've discovered in terms of our researches is that the potential to take a holistic viewpoint in terms of design and to look at the way in which it could improve the future of the city, increase mobility. And if you take a holistic approach to that, then it becomes not just about transport. And here there's a certain dilemma, because we've done quite a lot of research, and we realize that the framework that supports a transport system like that also could elevate a pedestrian route, it could elevate a bicycle route, it could free it of the constraints of traffic, it could create more green space, and then it could link buildings. It could encourage urban farming, and particularly in terms of the way that it can be inserted into an informal settlement, a slum. And also it can help create, it can clean the immediate environment. In other words, it can banish the effects of air pollution. Now, these are kind of far-reaching, almost like dreams, but over the course of our studies, we've accumulated a body of knowledge, and at some point we will be in a position to reveal that. So that's really just a glimpse into the background of some of the work that we've been doing. So I think if I hand over back to Tim. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Norman. Today's public debate is an important moment in this week-long workshop that Norman has just described. And Norman has also just taken the clicker away from me. Thank you. Let me provide a little more context to what it is that we're exploring, and what it is that I think gives us a dynamic landscape of change in urban mobility. There are a number of drivers that we're going to hear more from our speakers about. Let me just list. Technology, a huge driver. The digital age we are now living in is changing the way that we work. Sociocultural, how we live and respond to this drive of change, is affecting all of our lives and has been for some time now. Who could imagine life without social media, for better or for worse? The environmental impacts, looking at just the storms of the last week, gives us a sense in which the climate is changing, and how we move is influencing and will be influenced by climatic change that we are part of. So what are the spatial, what are the physical responses that architects, planners, transport planners, engineers can create to give rise to new forms of living that accommodate these dynamics? Well, on the one hand, yes, technology is allowing us to move digitally, and that means perhaps we don't need to move physically. But on the other, technology is allowing us better than ever before to understand how people move. This pedestrian model was created now over 20 years ago for the work we did in Trafalgar Square together. It allowed us to anticipate and persuade people to change the way that that square would work. The more we do, the more we understand how if you live without a car and you are stuck at home without neighbors because you're living at low density, we can understand loneliness and how that impacts on the lives of very many people now and the health budgets of people being prescribed the drugs to help them through their loneliness created by a lack of mobility. Technology is helping planners and transport planners integrate with health practitioners, their practice, so that we can connect across the silos that have so often been created in the 20th century of planning. Can I have my next slide, please? Thank you. So, in response, as an architect, I feel strongly more than ever before the need to connect. I will show only briefly this project from northeast China with an elevated railway that's being used as an opportunity to bridge across a highway so that people who don't even use the railway can use the infrastructure of the railway to complete pedestrian journeys, and in doing so, connect the city back to the water from where the city grew in the first place. I'll be interested to hear more from our speakers, but for me, the mobility of the future is in many ways helping us to retrieve memories of a city that has been lost to the motor car. And in connecting with each other, we must also remember just to connect with ourselves. I love this picture of Trafalgar Square, of the steps that Norman and our teams created to bring new flows through Trafalgar Square. But this chap in the middle is on his own, and that wonderful moment in the city of being happily on your own amidst the dynamic kinetic of the city is, for me, a great objective in considering mobility. So I'm going to pass now the baton to Alfredo Brillembourg, who's going to come up and talk about his practice. From Venezuela to Europe and throughout the world, he is affecting change using mobility to influence the detailed lives of people. Alfredo, the stage is yours, and I look forward to what you have for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's go. Architecture as a constitutional right. That's the idea. Urban think tank. It's kind of a manifesto. I'll go fast. Later, all of you can maybe ask me for the presentation, no problem. 8 notes on architecture. 1, alternative mobility, right? Who thought that you could put a cable car on the top of favelas in Caracas? This is in Caracas, in the center of the city, San Agustin, and it is 70,000 people on a hill, 5 stations connecting it in a loop that goes down to a subway station. Here you see basically the plan. And then, of course, we don't just want the loop, because that would be a merry-go-round. You want to fill it with social program all along. Everything in red is new and added to the building. The station's prefabricated, so you go vertical, you integrate mobilities, new mobilities, introduce new technologies, rethink those technologies, of course. And then people who took 2 hours to go up and down that hill can go down in 10 minutes, women who are pregnant, old men who couldn't get to hospitals, etc. You change completely people's lives. You give them access to the city. 2, public space as a building. In areas where sports and playgrounds are not available because of the difficult terrain and all of the density of the favelas, we came up with the idea to build vertical sports centers. They can change in program. You can completely change the skin. Artists, locals can really customize the building for themselves. You can plop them on top of parking garages, informal markets, with two different characters, all in prefabricated steel. And basically, it's where there was 800 square meters of just a basketball court. You created 4,000 square meters of running track, sports, and weightlifting tatami. 3, everyone has the right to go education. So what about schools as factories, right? Well, in Barranquilla, they have a carnival. And you know, it's the Proceso de Paz, peace process. So we came up with the idea, why don't we create a school for carnival? Why should carnival not be the greatest thing and let everyone have access to it? So on top of an old tobacco factory, we've done the remodeling, and on top we'll grow the new carnival art school. Here you see it, basically an open structure. We call it an open building. It's very simple. All of our architecture, this aesthetics of the architecture is in the structure. And below is an auditorium that's cool because Barranquilla is very hot with a vaulted ceramic vault, and then the inside with a wind tunnel going through. Here you see some of the images and the building. So housing, everyone has a right to housing. In South Africa, in Caliche, in the most difficult terrain you can imagine, people are growing and growing and growing in squatting land because they're coming to the city. They have a right to the city. What do? So we said, let's do an experiment. It's under construction. Now I'll show you. We took one small area of Caliche, got together the community, with the community, decided what should be done. The leaders and the builders of the project are the community. And what did we come up with? What's the best typology for the city on a low scale basis? It's row houses. And there's firewalls in between, and then the rest. So we just build the firewalls. The aesthetic is the firewalls, and the house, the facades are done with the same tin and recuperated. But how to live, the size of each house is all determined by the user. We created a program to be able to come to a community agreement on how to distribute the houses. A vision that is co-authored with the community, and then here you see the row houses beginning to go up and change. And finally, some moved in, and it's changed people's lives. So finally, I'm getting close to number 8, city as an adventure playground. In Barcelona, of course, maybe some of you know, in La Plaza del Mar, La Plazoleta del Mar, that was full of little houses, tabernas, little structures of fish food and restaurants. So we said, and yet in the 1980s Olympics, they were erased, they were eliminated. So we said, let's return a market square to La Plaza del Mar. So provisional market square that would be able to be used by users in different ways over a period of time, and it was super successful. So successful that the neighbors complained that they used to have silence, and now they had a market. And here you see a few photographs. 6, building as a landscape. Here comes the integrated mobility. A building in the worst place of Sao Paulo, in Parisopolis, a favela of 100,000. Right in the middle, we came up with the idea to make a music school and a dance school. In the worst terrain, because it was flooding, it's like the bowl, it's like the navel of the favela, no access, no roads. We first had to put in a road, create a mobility system, transport a little mini bus, and then the building itself has a public elevator, a walkway that goes up to a secondary road with replacement housing, and then the park, of course, is for outdoor music viewing and theater viewing. And all the water that used to flood is recuperated into tanks and filtered through the floor plates and into the building. And the aesthetics, again, just the Brise Soleil block, the typical Brazilian, and here it is under construction. 7, prototypes as concepts. Maybe it's best to think about mobility has been throughout all my work, like I guess taking from Le Corbusier, is the ramp. Of course. And this is a school for autistic children. They can't go up elevators because they can't coordinate. They get claustrophobic, and they have trouble with stairs. So the whole building became a ramp like the Guggenheim. It goes all around the building. And people said, no, that won't work. Well, it works just fine. The kids go up in the morning to their workout, and then they come down. They look into the classrooms. They're no longer scared of where they're going, and they run down sometimes. Even they're protected. And then we saved a park, and the park is next door, and the ramp continues into the park. Finally, to conclude, discourse as architecture. Some students here, I think it's important to address to all of you that architecture and a project can also be a book. And that's what we've done. Everything we build, we try to convert into theory and vice versa. And thinking about how to do that is the question, the dialectic of my life. Yeah, thank you very much.
Perfect. I feel like the most mobile person in Madrid at the moment. Up and down, up and down. Let me introduce our next speaker, Tilly Chang. Tilly is the Executive Director at the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. And she has degrees in transportation and economics. So she brings the mobility together with the money. The floor is yours.
Hear me? Terrific. I first want to thank Lord and Lady Foster so much for bringing me here. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to BYD as well. It's a pleasure to discuss with you our view from San Francisco about urban planning and mobility within that framework. It takes a village to make the transit village, doesn't it? So our first sort of concept that I want to share in San Francisco is the city as a laboratory. We're constantly evolving, and we want to continue to keep pushing the boundaries. In San Francisco, you can argue we're built out. We're actually not built out, just the eastern part of the city. But what we're doing in places like Treasure Island here, between the Oakland and San Francisco downtown centers, is creating a whole new sustainable neighborhood. We're trying to bring together the land use of the 8,000 units of housing, 26% affordable, with no additional burden on our transportation system. What does that take? It takes brand new ferry service. It takes bus service on both ends of the bay. It takes a circulator shuttle, which we're proposing to be autonomous vehicles. And it takes a toll. How are we going to pay for it? It takes a toll. So we actually have legislation from the California legislature that passed in 2008 under Governor then Schwarzenegger to provide a congestion toll, generating revenue then to pay for all the urban mobility. And in terms of land use, I just really want to emphasize, it's the #1 issue for an urban area to be able to show that you can handle the development through the transportation system and the mitigations. And most of the time, we all know the power of land use in driving transportation. But in an urban area, isn't it the transportation that really gives permission for the development to happen? Because that is also where the concern of the citizens typically is. You all know we have a booming economy. We have massive congestion. We've got 80 hours a year lost in congestion, and that's 2 weeks of your time with your family. So we're trying to explain always, what does it take to manage congestion? It's not a bad thing necessarily. I hope we debate this later. Is congestion good? Is congestion a priori bad? And there's many things that I would argue that we should also be mindful of making sure the city is walkable, is transitable, and has transit-first qualities. We've had a transit-first policy in San Francisco since 1973. That is our North Star. That is what's guiding us through all of the change that is happening, the rapid change. I'm in the same building as Uber. It was funny coming into the airport. We saw Uber in Spanish is Uber. Did you see this ad? It was very funny. Well, so around the world, we have Uber, we have Lyft, we have Lime, we have sit-down scooters, we have stand-up scooters, we have bike share, we have car share. So all this change is dizzying. It's making our heads spin. And yet, really, what is most important is those things that are durable. Our transit-first policy is durable. It has been serving us for 40 years. It began with our downtown plan. It began with BART, the investment in the heavy rail. It began with low parking ratios for our downtown core, recognizing the interplay, the system between investment and policy and land use and the walkable city. Now we are in a stage of management, right? We have our city streets. 30% of our land area is streets. Trying to get that right is a constant challenge. But now we are also renewing it and we are managing it. We are trying to make sure that the priority is correct both in time and in space. This means the signals are timed for the walking speed, not 4 feet per second, but 2.5 feet per second, so that seniors, the disabled, children, indeed, are being designed for and accommodated. We're trying to make sure that we're utilizing the Bay Bridge correctly. If you'll see this graphic, across the bridge, the vehicle part of the bridge serves 14,000 vehicle trips per hour, but, per peak period. However, underneath, our BART system carries twice the ridership, right? So that is not intuitive, it's invisible to everyone, but there we have the argument that we really need to invest in a second tube, which is very exciting. We hope that will be a high-speed rails tube as well as a BART tube. And we're trying to connect our region with carpools. Interestingly, for some reason, we have no carpool lanes touching San Francisco. There's a reason I can explain later, but we are now working and collaborating with the region, our partners around the Bay Area, and with the private sector. In fact, Google has put out $50 million commitment to build out the carpool lanes between San Francisco and San Jose. So it really is a public-private partnership because we all understand how important it is to move people, not vehicles. Complete streets and placemaking, we're learning from you all, from the rest of the world, and we're really trying to bring together the lessons of Bogota, the lessons of your European cities, for the walkable streets, for the BRT, and the ways to move people efficiently, while also making the street a great civic place, right? We have to have absolutely pedestrian safety. We have to have great urban design, and you'll see in a moment, we have to have a renewal of our infrastructure, both underneath the invisible sewer, which is a 100-years-old brick sewer under Van Ness Avenue, as well as a beautiful arrangement, an organization of our streets on top. And this project actually was a collaboration with our State Department of Transportation, Caltrans, traditionally a highway department, but now transforming itself as a public institution to be multimodal and forward-thinking. State of good repair. As many of you know, our cities are old and your cities are even older. But in San Francisco, we could spend our entire capital budget on maintenance. However, we know we need to also manage and improve our public infrastructure as we're tearing down freeways, as we're repurposing our public spaces. We can ensure that they are beautiful places. We have taken down the Embarcadero Freeway and created a beautiful waterfront boulevard. We have taken down the Central Freeway and also created a boulevard where the reinvestment of the land that the Caltrans Department of Transportation gave us has gone into affordable housing through a redevelopment project, and that has renewed the street. We have had the first public-private partnership on the state highway network in San Francisco called Doyle Drive. It's the lead up to the Golden Gate Bridge. I invite you all to come. On your way to the Golden Gate Bridge, please notice that we have a beautiful parkway now traveling through the Presidio National Park because of the P3. And this is really just the theme of modernization, investing in our infrastructure, but also replacing that infrastructure with a beautiful and functional system that helps further, the movement of people and goods in a humanistic way. Active transportation, led by our Vision Zero commitment passed in 2003, we're joining the world community in planning for the elimination of severe injuries and fatalities on our streets. I'm proud to say that after 3 or 4 years of investment and policy, we've been able to drive that down 30%. But we have a long way to go. We do have a long way to go. There still is a mentality that I need to just get through this neighborhood. Our south of Market area, which is the former industrial area, is really now the center of gravity has pushed south. That is our core, but it's where we have 70% of trips cutting through neighborhoods, Filipino neighbors, Latino neighbors, all these families who are trying to live their daily lives when 70% of the streets, every numbered street is a freeway exit or entrance. So our agency is taking a look at the interface of the freeway and the local street network so that that intersection right there actually has a crosswalk. It has the proper signal timing, and it has the right interface for safety. Transportation funding and innovation. I cannot tell you how frustrating it is that we have no real national policy on infrastructure investment in the United States. And I say that to be provocative. I really do challenge our national government, the administration, to take up that infrastructure topic. But in the absence of that, it is states, it is cities that are now stepping up. We have 26 states that have passed either gas taxes or other ways, user fees, to fund our transportation system, which has been 50, 60 years old now. It needs to be reinvested. In California, last year, our governor passed with the legislature SB 1 to raise the gas tax for the first time in 20 years, but it is now facing repeal. And equity, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about equity in the afternoon. there's so much to say here, and we are very committed to ensuring that we are planning for all of the areas of our city that are facing disparities, and technology can be a path toward that equity and to renew our climate commitments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tilly, for that very, very open, honest, and very ambitious look at what's been happening in San Francisco County. Our final speaker is Carlo Ratty, who also brings two worlds together, the world of the architect, the world of the engineer. Carlo, you've got so much to show us of how you also make the digital physical. I'm going to leave the stage to you. Carlo Ratty.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Elena Norman, and everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. So in just 10 minutes, I decided today to take a different perspective on mobility. I will not show the work we are doing at our design office. Maybe that's next time. But today I want to tell you about a strange type of mobility related to these type of things. You know, that's the computer we got down there. And today you know everything about the computer. You know, every chip, you can see where it was made, how it moved on the planet, how it became that machine. Today we know everything about the global supply chain. But then a few years from now, you stop using the computer, you sell it to somebody. At some point, somebody will throw it away. And then we don't know anything anymore. Sometimes this is what happens. A lot of e-waste being shipped illegally to developing countries, from Europe to Africa, from the United States to Asia. So our idea was, you know, what could we understand there? But first of all, let's look a little bit at what we could call not the supply chain, but the removal chain. If you look at the removal chain yesterday and today, it hasn't changed that much. For instance, what you see here, this was New York over 100 years ago, how waste was processed in the city. You know, we don't see it, but it happens every day. And this is actually how it happens today in one of the most sophisticated waste management plants in the country. Oh, sorry, which is not that different. So we started looking at that and trying to analyze this and trying to understand what is going on in this, which is a big part of the mobility that we don't see much, but actually keeps our cities functioning. It keeps our city functioning because we know that, you know, usually we don't see it, but then if something goes wrong, this happens. And then we notice it. We understand what is going on. There's many other questions related to waste. There's a question about environmental justice. Look at this map. It shows the actually toxic waste and race in the United States. If you look at that, they correlate to an extent you could not imagine. If you look at this map, it's a green and red map of the United States. It's not a political map, the Republicans and Democrats, but it's not that different. If you look carefully, you see all the cities. And you see in all the cities you've got blue, and blue is a recycling facility. So the price of land is high and you recycle. But if you are in the middle of the United States and land is very cheap, you know, what's easiest? You just take stuff and you dump it into landfill. And you see that the red dots. So we started looking at all of this, and then we tried to understand, you know, how can we better study this system? How can we really look at all these flows that happen in our cities? But, you know, they haven't been studied that much, and many times they're invisible. How can we make them visible? And our idea was quite simple, was, you know, well, what if we could put a little tag on trash, on waste? And then start following it. So we tag it, and then we trace it, and we look at what goes to the right place, to the wrong place. You know, we can follow it through the whole chain. Now, to do this, we couldn't find anything off the shelf to do it, any tag off the shelf, so we had to design a little tag. It's something like a simplified cell phone. What it does, you know, your cell phone transmits a lot of data for a limited amount of time, for 1 day or 2 days, and then you need to charge it again. And then in this case, you wanted something that could last for maybe 3 months or 6 months or even a year, and transmit very limited data, just, you know, position, to know where you are and send it back. So those are the tags we did, you know, we engineered. We then had to put them into, to protect them, and you see here, we tried different materials to make sure they don't break up. We worked with volunteers. The first deployment was in Seattle, so we worked with many volunteers in order to tag different type of things, both e-waste, but also banana peel. You see, the volunteers came with every possible thing. You know, we tagged them. I'll show you some of them. This was, you know, this was a lady who came and said, you know, a young lady who came and said, you know, well, my boyfriend is going to leave me unless I get rid of the little teddy bear. I had it since I was a kid, but at least I want to know where the teddy bear will end up. And so we put a little tag in the teddy bear. I need to tell you, Asaf was the associate director of our lab, you know. However, he's Israeli, you know, it was a bit rough, you know, it took the scissors to cut the teddy bear to put the tag inside. It was a bit It was a bit harsh. So you see a lot of the kids who play with this. You know, we can work with 500 volunteers, 3,000 pieces of trash. You see them here, some of them. That's the first deployment. If we can have the sound as well. Should be from there. We tested the sound before, but it's not happening now. Podemos con el sonido. Antes estaba bien. Okay. Anyway, we put sorry about that. We put tags on all of these things. Again, many different pieces of trash, and then we started following them. Okay. Well, let's see if they can fix the sound. But anyway, you see the day of deployment in Seattle. You see, after a few days, you see some of the main landfills next to Seattle. But then a big surprise, actually, how far stuff started to travel. Sometimes in crazy, unexpected ways. Look at the trace went all the way to Chicago, changed his mind, and went back to California. And look at how much waste from the West Coast coming to the East Coast. You know, especially when you go special things like cell phones and other e-waste, and they travel a lot. And I think the interesting thing is that, you know, all this movement hadn't been mapped fully. So today, everybody's doing a small piece of the chain, but it was the first time we actually combined all of them. Now, I'm sorry there was no music. It was, you missed the fireworks simply. But si es posible por después va a ser, it's going to be interesting because for the last one, we want the music. What did we learn from this? 4 things in the remaining 4 minutes. Lesson number 1. Well, if you analyze all of this, you learn a lot about how we can make the system much more efficient. Look at this, you know, it's just a container. You learn about all of them, and because you combine all the traces, you can see how this can be done in a more efficient way. So, for instance, I showed before, you know, how different things move sometimes in crazy ways. It's a similar thing, 2 cartridges, one move like this, the other one went to the same place, but, you know, for thousands of kilometers. It's a huge waste of energy. Also, we discovered places such as this one. You know, we saw this place, which is a gravel facility, which is not an EPA facility for waste. And actually, we wrote to them and say, what's going on? We found a lot of tags there, and they told us, we don't know what you're talking about, but clearly there was some illegal waste being dumped there. So the question is, you know, you learn more, and then you can fix some of the system. And you can look at that. There's a few papers. You can study it and see. Sometimes we put more energy than what we will ever get back by recycling. Then the second lesson has been that basically if you share information with people, and we had this kind of data being available to all the volunteers, 500 volunteers, 3,000 traces, and, you know, they could check it. And that's interesting because it tells you a lot about your life, about the consequences you're having on the environment, and then it can help you to change your behavior. So data itself, big data, if you share it, it can have a powerful impact. I remember a little story from a lady who came to us and said, well, you know, I used to drink water in plastic bottles every day, then throw them away, and of course forget about them. But now I cannot stop thinking that those bottles, after the project, I cannot stop thinking that they go to a landfill next to home. They will stay there forever. And so I stopped drinking water in plastic bottles. Now, the third thing we discovered is that actually a lot of traces ended up at ports. And then we couldn't follow them anymore. And so over the past 3 years, we've been working on a follow-up project. We look at e-waste, but globally. Global flows of e-waste. We discovered places such as this one, in the middle of the jungle in Africa, in the middle of the forest in Africa. If you're interested, there's all the traces on the online. You can click on them and see what they are. Some of those are legal. Some of those are not legal. But here, big data can tell us a lot about the global flows. And then hopefully, we can start changing things, fixing things, you know, putting pressure on politicians in order to do something. Now, the final thing we discover, let's hope there's a sound here. The final thing we discover is something that was totally unexpected, utterly unexpected. And that happened when a burglar came to our lab, to our offices at MIT. And this poor guy stole a lot of things, including tags and computers that tell you where they go. And this is what happened. stay on the stage.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you to all the speakers. We're going to reset the stage now for a little bit of discussion around some of these issues. That'll be 10 or so minutes, after which we'd like to throw the floor open to yourselves for any questions. So just have a think now about what we might do, what you might want to ask any of the speakers about any of the issues that they've shown here today. So please, can the speakers come and join me? Yeah, I can see you all. My first question is actually what we've seen today are many ideas about removal. I wasn't really thinking of the removal of laptops from MIT, but the removal of waste, the removal of freeways at massive cost, and maybe the removal of some preconceptions about how kids should be educated. And the future is about perhaps taking away as much as adding. Do you have any thoughts as to what we should be doing less of?
We should be doing less of dividing cities with infrastructure. One of the things that we are most excited about is fixing the mistakes of the past and creating more public space through reinvestment and redesign of our infrastructure. So we have a rail line coming into the city. We're trying to put it in a tunnel configuration for high-speed rail, and that will really reknit the urban fabric, creating actually more streets, but also just more land area for housing. So
Alfredo, when people leave here this afternoon, they go back to work, they go back to study, what should they do less of?
Probably knock down buildings. I think everything should be recycled, reused, rethought, the city relived. So the city really needs to a new way of unleashing the capital that exists. If you think about all the protected patrimony in the city, all of the blocks of the cities of Madrid, that it has incredible value, but it can't be unleashed because it's frozen. Nothing can be done, nothing can be added, too many regulations. So we have to remove a lot of the codes and free it up. But I don't mean it'll be chaotic. That's not what my intention is. We can model exactly what we want now.
Yeah. Maybe to add, I think, you said remove, but I really would say, like you said, reuse. And I think reuse is in many different dimensions. If you look in mobility, we were saying this morning, that the mobility systems of the 20th century were highly inefficient. A car is used on average, still today, around 5% of the time. And 95% of the time, not only it's not used, but actually it uses very valuable space in our cities. And then a car is a huge amount of real estate, and usually, you've got 1 or 2 people inside, on average 1.6 in the United States. So I think I'd say if you use better in reuse, I think we can make a big difference. I think if you do it right, it goes 2 things. We're going to have a win-win. One win is about we're going to save resources, and it's vital. But the other win is that we're going to share more. And so it's going to be more sociable. So I think I would say is both sustainability and sociability can come out of that.
And Tilly, you talked about some of your work after the removal of those freeways, those elevated roadways. What do you do with the space beneath? What are the choices? Because I guess one choice is fill it up with more ground level transportation, but what are the other options?
Right. So we've started to really view the street not only as a way for sustainable transportation, but for incredible urban design, for public spaces, as you mentioned, that there's not urban green spaces for folks to play and communities to share. So we have created parklets. Parklets, for example, is a very small concept of instead of a parking space, as Carlos mentioned, you create a little pavilion, a public space that you can use for the businesses to have seating, for public gathering spaces, as well as for bicycle parking, for example. And those are the types of uses. We also have homeless navigation centers underneath our freeways or in our former freeway areas where we really have to create ability to use them for social purposes, for urban skate parks, for kids to have a place to be after school, and also, of course, for sustainable transportation, for bikeways, for transit lanes, and for sidewalks, wider sidewalks.
And I think, to me, that is really crucial. It's about how can we cities with more spaces for sharing things. Again, it goes back to sharing. Right. In that case, what is a city? I mean, Shakespeare asked, the city, what is the city but the people? The city is asking, is about sharing. It comes together for the sharing of goods, of ideas, of chromosomes, of, other things. And that's really why we're all here together in cities. And I think, thinking about it to me is a key challenge today, especially with cities becoming fragmented, polarized, the middle class disappearing, with, segregation increasing, how we can create those spaces. I didn't show any projects we are doing in design, but we want a competition to convert the former World Expo site, the World's Fair site in Milan 2015, into an innovation park. The University of Milan is there and so on. And the key principle of the design is actually what we call a common ground. And the common ground means that the 6 meters at the base of all the buildings can be used privately, but it is accessible to everybody. It's part of this space that you need to feel it can be your space, and you cannot seclude and segregate or exclude others from it.
We've seen incredible presentations at the foundation yesterday, today already, and more tomorrow. What I've seen are two different versions of the future. One, Carlo, you showed cars moving ever more efficiently. Alfredo, you showed a city without cars. What is the future, with or without?
So, Jimmy, let me catch on to that sharing idea. So what about a code for the city that's time-based? So in other words, spaces can be programmed over time. With your app, you can get 2 square meters, 5 square meters, 10 square meters. You can use it at certain different times. Well, actually, Mumbai does that. And they have market squares where the cows come in at a certain time. Then the cafes open up. Then at night there's the parties. And it's all time-based use of public space. So what I'm really talking about when I say the car-free city, well, it doesn't mean there's no mobility. There's tons of mobility. It's just all integrated, and it's not private-owned vehicles. So it's the 1 kilometer inner radius is actually programmed totally different, and its uses. So cars might come in to service that inner core, but it's got its time also when it can come in from 4 in the morning to 6 or whatever. So, but what's also interesting is, why do we think of property? If we're talking about sharing, what about sharing property? Why do we think of property always extruded? Buildings extruded up as you own the vertical extrusion of your property. What about horizontal properties? How about moving between properties, like the High Line? Imagine the High Line in New York all connected with buildings, which is initially what they wanted it to be, right? But then they couldn't figure out, well, if you go into a building, is that a public way? Who owns it? Who cleans it? Who maintains it? Under what insurance company should that fall, etc.? That's where the problem gets complex. But the complex can be solved now.
Yeah. I'll say, I think there's two answers here. The first answer is yes, we can actually design cities that become more flexible, and we can change things. Incidentally, we just a couple of months ago a prototype with Google of a new street in Toronto. Google is developing a chunk of Toronto of a street that actually can change. And in the morning it's for self-driving cars, in the evening becomes a place for a block party. And you change it very easily, and you have a little bit of robotics that moves the things around, and what in the evening is a beautiful social space, in the morning you might need to use it for, when there's actually less demand for that, you might want to use it for people. But I think there's a more important point here, and that's why I think we should all be thankful to the foundation to bring all of you here, because in the future it's not something we can predict. It's not something that's written in stone. The future is what we will all, and you in particular as citizens, build in the next few years. The future, what we can do is actually explore different things. I think you've seen different ideas, and then STEAM is good that we explore different ideas of a city only with pedestrians, with bikes, with cars, but then the decisions are decisions we should all make collectively. And that's a very big difference versus the idea of architecture in the mid-20th century. When architects think about or Robert Moses, they thought they had a solution, just had to implement it, knock down chunks of New York and do it. That was the solution. I think the point is different. Is how can we use design as a way to explore the future, to see how things could be, and then all together, with all of you, with the whole city, we should decide, what type of city we want.
So I have a question about the future. Norman talked about some work the foundation is doing with BYD. It'll be revealed at some point. What is it you're working on that you can't tell us about? Or what is it that you'd like to be working on that there are people in this room that could be helping you with? Tilly.
Actually, building on the last question you asked, what is the one thing that's worse than a solo occupant car? A zero occupant car. right? The zombie car. The idea that you'll have these roving private vehicles going back and forth and trying to pick up your wife or your partner and your children and whatnot. So what we really need is your help to identify what is the best way to create that vision of full high occupancy vehicles moving people around efficiently, whether that is a shuttle, whether that is a monorail, whatever that is. We need to make sure that we have these higher capacity or the right sized capacity vehicles, and to manage our curb that way. The exciting part of curb management, which is the one thing cities all get to manage, that land use, that curb, is bringing technology to that so that you have time of day allocation of that curb space, so that you have occupancy-based allocation of that curb space. And in that way, we can be effective and efficient. But I don't know how to do that yet, so I need your help.
Okay, that's great. Alfredo, what are you working on?
So if we're thinking about language, the problem is we need a new vocabulary, right? Everything's getting very strange and gray and hybrid, right? So we no longer, or we used to know what right and wrong was in a city or not, but actually we need to start to understand that people have different codes. Communities, inequality, different income backgrounds, we all have different codes of how to read that city, how to talk about it, how to live in that city. So I'm working on something for Cape Town, which is quite controversial. It's, I think, cost the mayor of Cape Town's position at the moment, which is Cape Town is bordered, just like the Boston Big Dig, it's bordered by highways that were never finished in the 70s. Now, the big debate was, do we knock down those highways? Do we finish them? What do we do? So I went and did a project that I called City Lift, which we knock down the highways. Highways, forget it. It's limiting your access to the waterfront. Cape Town's a beautiful city. And actually, as it bends down to the waterfront, to the port, it needs mobility along the edge. So we said, we can't bury it because the water levels are too high. So we leave it on grade, but we build the new city over. And so Cape Town now effectively would come down and then slightly go back up. And so you would have this beautiful view over the water. It would be a green park with new buildings, new civic spaces, integrated, all the mobilities underneath popping up through, all integrated. And it's a huge controversial project at the moment. You can read it in the press.
That's great. I'm glad you mentioned the water. So many projects that are transportation related seem to have water associated with them because we've built our transport at the water's edge. It was deemed to have low value. We've now realized actually it's a wonderful place to be if you can get there, the Embarcadero being an example. Carlo, water, future?
Yeah, well, no, different projects. I'll tell you something we are quite passionate about at the moment. We have a few startups that have been growing significantly over the past 3-4 years. And one of them is actually dealing with robotics. And I'm quite passionate about it because I think we all know that robots are going to change our lives. And according to a study by the University of Oxford, up to half of the jobs we know today could disappear, could vanish because of this. But very few people look at this. So I think this does different type of robotics, different type of designs. The latest one is a little thing that we want to kickstart a couple of months ago. There's a little robot that draws on your walls and allows you to express and do art in your home and so in a different way. And for us, it's a way to play with this. But I think what you could do, and more generally for the city, and what we should all do, is to be active citizens. I think, the very important thing is that designers, so all of us with ideas, we can put the ideas forward. But it is very important to understand what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. I think it was Hemingway who, towards the end of his life, in an interview to Vanity Fair, he said, what is the most important thing? And he replied, he said, the most important thing is the bullshit detector. To understand what is bullshit and what is not bullshit. And that's what we should all determine. We should all determine as citizens, and in order to understand, what is a good idea for the city, what is not, and how do we want to shape ourselves in a collaborative way the future we live in.
Great. In a couple of minutes, we'll have a couple of microphones, so make yourselves obvious and available to ask your questions. But my last question while you're doing that is the difficult one about what the future will look like. If you could think of one or two aspects of what the future mobility solutions will look like for cities, how could you describe them? Who'd like to kick off?
Well, I can certainly try it. It's a positive vision, and although climate change is an imminent reality, we haven't been able to reverse it. So it's going to be a lot like Blade Runner in the tropics. So it's going to be like an upgraded slum with integrated mobilities and new densities, but an incredibly vibrant feeling, a lot like Mumbai.
Okay.
Beat that.
High capacity transit, rail, monorail, BRT, everywhere, and pricing, road pricing, to ensure that the transit systems of the future can grow and thrive.
So I think all of this is on tape. So now I need to ask all of you, we reconvene here in 50 years, we watch the tape and we will all laugh. And the reason is that the future, we don't know what it will be. We saw this morning also, Norman showed some beautiful images of how people imagine the future like 50 years ago. The 1st of December 1900, the Boston Globe, the newspaper of the city where I spent most of my time, did an article on how life would have been in the year 2000. And, and that was about mobility. And, they screwed up everything. They were thinking about we would have moving sidewalks, blimps in the sky. They saw all of this and never materialized, and they missed all the important thing. Clearly, they didn't see Uber or the internet or Amazon for delivery and so on. And that point is that, the future is not written in stone. It's something you can predict. I think the future will show us many exciting things in the next few decades. But to me, the interesting thing is not try to imagine it. Even try to predict it is useless. It's about building it and giving feedback. It's basically transforming the present more than thinking about the future.
Thank you. And I guess learning from what you've built in order to inform, going back and looking rather than moving on to the next project.
Time for another. The one thing I'm sure of in the architectural education is we've got to stop copying. Because, we're just copying old models. And if you're going to be an innovator, in today's society, the next innovator will certainly not do a portal like Google. The next innovator will not do electric cars like Tesla. So it's going to be completely different ideas. So the point is, there's a great story about at one point all the dog food companies, Purina, etc., all wanted to go online because they thought that was the next big thing. So they all spent $300 million mounting their websites to sell dog food online, as dogs were getting very popular. And they all wasted a lot of money because half of them didn't work out because they lost to the competition. So this idea of dog eats dog world is actually defeating the purpose. The competition that we're taught in school to learn how to spell, and then if you're not the good speller, if you're mathematics, if you're not the good mathematic kid, right? Well, there are a lot of people who have great ideas who don't excel or don't get the opportunity to innovate because the system is knocking down those out-of-the-box thinkers.
Yeah, thank you.
But the idea is, I think we should copy more. I think copying is good. Nature just copies. So I think, we should copy more. We'll discuss it later.
Okay. All right, now this is your chance. I'm going to try to look through as many degrees as I can. Who has a question they'd like to put to the floor? Make yourselves known and available, please. And help me do my job.
There's a hand.
Thank you, sir. Just wait a moment for the microphone to arrive.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for the debate. It was really interesting. My question is mainly to Chang, because I would like to know how do you change a political culture, such as San Francisco one, about car dependence, into these new model transports and these new ways.
Okay. Well, I'm a living embodiment of it. I moved from the peninsula to San Francisco 5 years ago with my family, 2 young boys. We shed our car because not only is there Muni and BART and Caltrain, we have Uber and we have Lyft in case, the Muni is not there or there's a particular reason I need it. And providing all the choices to people so that the community knows that they can rely on traditional public transportation, but also new private services. The difficulty, I think, is the equity problem that we are already seeing. We are already seeing some communities having access and others not. We're seeing public transportation losing ridership. BART is losing ridership to Lyft and Uber at San Francisco Airport. We see the data very clearly. So we have to be able to move everyone together toward a zero-car future or zero-car household future where people can feel confident they can live their lives and have other options.
Terrific. The eyes in the back of my head say we have a question behind me.
Thank you. I have a question for the whole panelists, for the whole group of panelists, and perhaps particularly to Tilly again. My question is on the future, or I will say present, of the self-driving cars. And it will be interesting to hear your thoughts from the regulatory aspect and also from a practical aspect. When do you think that future will become a present, a reality? And how do you think that will transform a city like San Francisco?
Great, and I think I'll open up this question to all of us because it's such an important dimension, the autonomous car, the regulatory, the practical dimensions.
It is a fascinating question, and I think that it's a public policy challenge of our time to be able to harness all the benefits of the safety benefits, of course, of autonomous vehicles, of the ability to provide alternatives to transit and to complement transit, especially for first, last mile and fill mobility gaps. The difficulty I feel and the fear we've seen is the proliferation, the explosion of VMT. And I've heard back 5 years ago, the mayor of Copenhagen said to Google X, "We don't want you to come." This is before Waymo, is Google X. We spent 25, 30 years retrofitting our city for the bicycle, and we're fearful of the autonomous vehicle. Now, I think it's up to us to shape that. The forces, however, that we're seeing already playing out through TNCs, through Lyft and Uber, are sobering, because we see already it's training the next generation of autonomous vehicle customers, and it is very troubling. I think so now is the time for us to respond, to be ready for the public policy challenge. How do you prioritize efficient, sustainable modes? How do you plan for equitable access to those services?
Thank you. Sure, I'm happy to add something. I think, autonomous cars are here. Technology is close to being there. There's different levels. Level 5 is still, we're not there yet, but we're very close. So technology is there, and I think every technology, again, can go in totally different directions. So theoretically, and that's some of the work that we did at the lab that's in the McKinsey report and so on that's usually quoted today, came from some papers we did where we demonstrated that you could run Madrid or New York or Singapore with 20% of the vehicles we have today. That's cool. At the same time, you could imagine another situation where self-driving cars become so cheap that people will not want to take mass transportation anymore, and then you're going to basically cannibalize public transportation, and then our cities will end up with much more cars than what we have today. So you got two totally different scenarios, a dystopian and a better one, and probably a worse one, we would all agree. And I think the difference between those is basically the decisions we make together collectively in cities, the taxation policy we put in place in order to decide if you're going left or right.
No. On the timeline, I should just add that I think it'll be a messy period. Many people believe over 15, 20 years. Maybe the first few private services will come out in the next few years at level 4. I think level 5 we're still a ways from. But we will have 20 years of a mixed fleet. The mixed fleet problem is a messy one for system managers, because I think we all know that in the way of adoption of clean vehicles, for example, certain wealthier parts of the community will have access sooner, and then those private behaviors will start to drive the use of those technologies.
Alfredo, autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, I like walking. So,
yes.
Yeah, so, can't I walk a mile? Really, do we really need a bunch of taxis running around? Can't we have the little scooters and stuff? But I am interested in what's going to happen to the public space. If we reduce the amount of area that we dedicate to the car, how do we design it? What do we do with it?
Bye, Carlos.
We all say goodbye to Carlo. Thank you. Yeah. Brief.
They told me there's a mobility issue I need to, anyway, so it was great to be with all of you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. We'll carry on. I think we have time for maybe one last question.
This is where you belong.
Stay with me. You can't all go.
Yes.
Yeah, so look, in Caracas, I used to have a car, of course. How could I not? When I got to Europe, I've never practically driven a car again. Public transport's pretty good. You have now electric bicycles everywhere, and you have shared rides and a series of other things, right? So I'm very curious how that autonomous car is going to work, but I don't really think we need it. But what I'm even more fearful about is Google City, Amazon City. Big corporations that are going to take over the areas of our city, because then we're going to have the stuff delivered to our home by one chain. And what I'm trying to get away from is that everyone be able to not have to pass through only one portal. Thanks.
All right. Now, the future is about making much, much more with much, much less. So we're going to have less time but more questions. So we'll have 2 questions at the same time. You first, sir, then you second, ma'am. We'll answer them in combination. No? Yep. Great. There's the microphone.
Okay. Well, hi. Keeping going to the innovation or big companies and stuff, I would like to ask you, what about the typology of location you have to have in big cities? Like you have IKEA, you have automotive, how you say it, fabricas, so factories, and you have also these Google in San Francisco or all California, all around. I know that, for example, Google has one data farm in Finland because of the heating. The company hits a big zone. How you improve that kind of politics in the cities where you have a lot of big trouble, climatological troubles and that kind of stuff?
Great. And the chap in front of you as well is the person I was looking at, but so you did very well.
Sorry. Well, first of all, I really want to thank Alfredo for this really fresh point of view outside Europe and the States. Thank you very much. I have a question. We're always looking up. How do we look down in these lower parts of society that aren't represented in media and in architecture usually? How do we emphasize architecture for all and not for high-tech 1% companies that are going to solve it all? We heard that before with the car. It's going to solve all our problems. So I'm really interested in how to give voice to these people from informal settlements, from lower income families.
And then if you just pass the microphone forward.
Innovation.
My question is somehow related. I wondered if the panelists had experience with any city administration that has been able to overcome the silos, because it seems that with a very inspirational and aspirational view of the city is a great thing, but when our cities are still divided in transportation department, maintenance department, housing department, it's very hard to implement that. Do you have any experience with administrations that are improving and becoming more innovative, as well as your ideas for the future city?
Great. So to try to bring those together, something on fear about digital data, heat, large corporations, something about how do we access the people who don't have a voice, and also then how can we find some good examples? Where would you go looking for those good examples?
These are 3 great questions. Let me quickly try to cover some of them. On the big data centers, I'm not too sure about that. I would answer that we're learning to work with big corporations, the big employers, by, as far as cities, letting them know what we want, what we need as far as mobility. We learned from Stanford. We learned from Santa Clara, which regulated Stanford, and Menlo Park, which did Facebook, and Mountain View, which had a relationship with Google, that said, you may develop. You can develop and you're growing. We understand that. But please don't clog up our city streets. And please don't continue to worsen congestion. Those cities created a trip cap on those organizations and those companies, and they have been able to manage the trip demand through a trip cap regulation. On the data centers, I'm not too knowledgeable, so I shouldn't try to answer that. But big box development, I'll also leave to my colleague. Regarding the pedestrian and sort of the travel for lower income folks, I mean, we just bow to the God of Peñalosa and all the other folks who have given voice to those who are more vulnerable. And I think if we plan for the vulnerable, seniors, children, disabled, through universal design, and to create pathways, dedicated street pathways, where you see the democracy of our streets by the allocation of the space, that is how we then ensure that we are planning for all and that we're serving all in the community. Regarding silos, 2 examples. In New York City, we saw Jeanette Sedet-Khan under the Bloomberg administration go after the Vision Zero goal in a very, very systematic way where she transformed government. She basically took the heat for her staff for very tough decisions to reallocate street space for safety, and she used that flag of safety around her to be able to really make the case also with data. But then in that way, she had not only led her Department of Transportation, but all the other city agencies around the common goal of Vision Zero. But it really required Mayor Bloomberg's political support to champion her and to support her leadership. In San Francisco, we have the first ever consolidation of public transportation and street DOT functions, the street and the traffic and the parking, into one agency. My sister agency, our sister agency in San Francisco, is the Municipal Transportation Agency. So under one roof, you have public transportation, you have traffic, you have parking, you have taxis, you have paratransit, biking and walking under one roof. And then it requires the mayor's leadership to really reach the potential of that organizational structure. But I think it's a starting point.
Thank you.
Well, if we think about that, growing cities and shrinking cities is the two sides of the same coin, right? Where a city grows, another one's shrinking at the same time. In the same way, rural and urban. So let's go with the big box idea. So at the same way, you've got people saying that let's not look at cities anymore, the urban, and let's look at the rural, right? Because the rural is urbanizing. Well, isn't that all the same thing? Like, basically it's urbanization, whether it be in the cities or in the region, and is urbanizing. So the big boxes are happening outside cities, right, in the rural farmlands, etc. And yes, that's something to be looked at, and that's a whole new urban scape. Now, how can you transform those big boxes so you can use the roofs, how you can sink them in the ground, you can transform them into sports fields, on top tennis courts, I don't know what you can do. That would be an interesting challenge so that we can still keep an ideal view of the rural. Okay, equity, right? Of course, bringing infrastructure into poor areas of cities, the edges of cities, is the way to give access, right? Access to sports, education, etc., all kinds of infrastructures. Now, if you think about in the next 30 years, 2 billion people will come on the earth, right? And we will go from 7 to 9 billion. Those 2 billion being born in the next 30 years will mostly be born in slums. So if you guys are the next generation, start to think about that reality. Start to go into that market. Start to think about, incredible technologies and things that could really address that. And I promise you, you'll be on the cutting edge of the future if you start to address that. And then maybe city. Well, I'm old-fashioned. Medellin. Mayor Fajardo in Medellin used infrastructure in the most classical way. As it's been used forever since the Russian avant-garde. Workers' clubs, schools, trains, transport. He basically used brick and mortar to bring it into cities. So yes, technology played an increasingly bigger role, but in the end, cities, places that have great inequities need some really basic things immediately.
Great. What a great way, what an inspirational way to draw this public debate to an end. Can I thank everyone for giving your time to be here today, in place and online? Can I thank the Norman Foster Foundation for convening this important event? Can I... And we continue to have these events. They will go on and on. Can I thank BYD for their sponsorship of this event, of this week, for making this all possible? And finally, can I thank our speakers, one of whom has had to go, for giving us a lot to think through. We should copy. We should stop copying. We should build transit. I think that was clear. And we shouldn't be going out there this afternoon to buy our own car. So a lot to think about as we plan our future. Thank you all very much. Thanks so much. That was fantastic. Well done. Please.
It was tough.
Greg,
Great job. Thanks, Norman. Thank you.
Ah, vale. Es que hacia aquí no se sujetaba. Vale, vale, gracias.
Ah, you found that. Oh, good.
Everyone, we've got a transfer for you, so we can also secret.
Can we all follow?